The morning sun barely penetrated the tall windows of courtroom 304 in the Philadelphia County Courthouse. It was 9:30 a.m. on a cold Tuesday morning, and Judge Marcus Sterling adjusted his black robe as he prepared for another day of cases. At 62 years old, with gray hair and tired eyes, he had spent 25 years on the bench, believing he had seen it all. The courthouse buzzed with its usual morning activities. Law clerks rushed through the marble hallways with stacks of papers, while lawyers in expensive suits whispered to their clients. The wooden benches in the courtroom were filled with people waiting for their cases to be called. Sarah Chen, Judge Sterling's clerk for the past 3 years, organized the day's files on his desk. She paused when she reached one particular case, frowning slightly as she noticed something, but before she could mention it, Judge Sterling waved her away. "Let's get started," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority he had cultivated over decades. The first few cases moved quickly, typical morning matters of traffic violations and minor offenses. Judge Sterling handled them with mechanical efficiency, barely looking up from his papers. His reputation for being strict, especially with certain defendants, was well known throughout the Philadelphia legal community, though no one dared to openly discuss it. At 10:45 a.m., Sarah called out the next case. Docket number 2024 CR 789, Commonwealth versus Dr. Maya Washington. A woman rose from the back of the courtroom. Dr. Maya Washington walked forward with quiet dignity, her steps measured and calm. She wore a navy blue business suit, her natural hair neatly styled, and carried herself with the composure of someone used to high-pressure situations. At 42 years old, she had the kind of presence that usually commanded respect in any room she entered. But Judge Sterling barely looked up. He shuffled through the papers, his reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose. The charge was a traffic violation that had escalated after a series of unfortunate events. A missed court date due to an emergency surgery she had to perform, followed by a misunderstanding with a police officer. "Your Honor," began Thomas Reed, Dr. Washington's attorney, "my client is a respected neurosurgeon at Philadelphia General Hospital. The missed court date was due to an emergency operation that couldn't wait. We have documentation." Judge Sterling cut him off with a wave of his hand. "The facts are simple, Counselor. Your client failed to appear for a court date and then argued with an officer of the law when he attempted to serve the bench warrant." Dr. Washington stood straight, her hands clasped in front of her. She had spent the last 18 hours performing 2 back-to-back brain surgeries, saving both patients' lives, before coming directly to court. Dark circles under her eyes hinted at her exhaustion, but her voice remained steady. "Your Honor, if I may explain," she started, but Judge Sterling's sharp glance silenced her. "The time for explanations was at your original court date, Ms. Washington," he said, emphasizing the Ms. while ignoring her professional title. The corner of his mouth twitched downward as he looked at the file again. In the gallery, several lawyers who had finished their own cases stayed to watch. They exchanged knowing looks. Judge Sterling's patterns were familiar to anyone who spent time in his courtroom. Sarah Chen shifted uncomfortably at her desk, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. She had noticed something in Dr. Washington's file, something important, but the judge's dismissive attitude made her hesitate to speak up. The tension in the courtroom grew thicker as Judge Sterling began his lecture. "This court's time is valuable, Ms. Washington. Your disregard for the law and subsequent behavior toward law enforcement shows a pattern of disrespect for our legal system." Dr. Washington remained composed, though her attorney looked increasingly concerned. The original traffic violation, a disputed right turn at a yellow light, had somehow snowballed into something much more serious. Sarah finally gathered her courage and began writing a note. She knew what was coming next. She had seen it too many times before. But this time, something was different. This time, she knew something the judge didn't. As Judge Sterling prepared to announce his sentence, the morning sun finally broke through the clouds outside, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. No one in the room, least of all Judge Sterling himself, realized that the next few moments would change everything. Judge Sterling cleared his throat, leaning forward in his high-backed chair. The fluorescent lights of courtroom 304 buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his stern face. Dr. Maya Washington stood perfectly still, her exhaustion from 18 hours of surgery hidden behind a mask of professional dignity. "Ms. Washington," Judge Sterling began, deliberately ignoring her title again, This court cannot function when individuals choose to disregard its authority. His voice carried through the now silent courtroom, where even the usual shuffling of papers had stopped. Sarah Chen's hand trembled slightly as she scribbled her note. She knew she had to act fast, but years of courtroom protocol made her hesitate. Interrupting a judge during sentencing was almost unheard of. Your original violation was minor, Judge Sterling continued, his tone growing harder with each word. But your subsequent actions show a troubling disrespect for law enforcement and this court. He paused, looking down at Dr. Washington over his reading glasses. The gallery had grown unusually full. Word had spread through the courthouse about what was happening in courtroom 304, and several lawyers and court staff found reasons to linger. They'd seen this pattern before. What started as a simple traffic ticket turning into something much more serious. Thomas Reed, Dr. Washington's attorney, stood up quickly. Your Honor, if we could submit evidence of the emergency surgery that caused. Counselor, Judge Sterling cut him off sharply. You've had your chance to speak. The time for explanations has passed. His fingers drummed against his desk, a habit he displayed when his patients wore thin. Dr. Washington's shoulders remained straight, but her fingers tightened around each other. In her mind, she saw the faces of the two patients she'd saved last night. A teenage boy with a brain tumor and an elderly woman with a severe hemorrhage. Both would have died if she hadn't missed that court date. This court sentences you to 30 days in county jail, Judge Sterling announced, causing a collective gasp from the gallery, plus a fine of $5,000 and, Your Honor. Sarah Chen's voice cut through the courtroom like a thunderbolt. In her 15 years as a court clerk, she had never interrupted a judge. Her hands shook as she rushed forward with her note, nearly tripping over her sensible shoes. Judge Sterling turned to her, his face flushing red at the interruption. Ms. Chen, what is the meaning of? But Sarah had already placed the note in front of him. Her usual neat handwriting was rushed and urgent. Dr. Maya Washington, Chief of Neurosurgery at Philadelphia General, saved Emma's life last October, your granddaughter's emergency surgery. The color drained from Judge Sterling's face as he read the note. His hands, usually so steady, began to tremble slightly. He looked up at Dr. Washington, really seeing her for the first time that morning. Memories flooded back, his 16-year-old granddaughter Emma, the terrifying phone call about her collapse at soccer practice, the desperate hours in the hospital waiting room. He remembered the surgeon who had walked out at 3 a.m., still in her scrubs, to tell them Emma would make a full recovery. The same surgeon who now stood before him in his courtroom. Dr. Washington, he said softly, her proper title finally finding its way to his lips. The change in his tone made everyone in the courtroom lean forward slightly. Dr. Washington met his gaze steadily. Yes, Your Honor. I remember Emma well. She had an arteriovenous malformation, a type of brain bleed. She's doing very well in her follow-up appointments. The silence in the courtroom grew heavy. Judge Sterling's hands moved to remove his reading glasses, revealing eyes that suddenly looked older and more troubled. The familiar walls of his prejudices began to crack, letting in uncomfortable rays of truth. Sarah Chen stepped back to her desk, her heart pounding. In the gallery, the watching lawyers exchanged meaningful glances. They all knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, a moment when justice, true justice, hung in the balance. Judge Sterling looked down at his sentencing notes, then back at Dr. Washington. His next words would either acknowledge his mistake or cement his prejudice. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone in courtroom 304, as heavy as the morning air before a storm. For 30 long seconds, Judge Sterling sat completely still in his chair, his face a mixture of shock and realization. The only sound in courtroom 304 was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant echo of footsteps in the hallway outside. He remembered that terrible night at Philadelphia General Hospital like it was yesterday. Emma, his beloved granddaughter, lying pale and unconscious on the hospital bed. The doctors explaining she needed emergency brain surgery. The endless hours of waiting, praying, hoping. And then Dr. Washington walking out of the operating room at 3 a.m., still in her surgical scrubs, telling them Emma would live. Your Honor. Thomas Reed's voice gently broke through the judge's thoughts. Perhaps we could take a brief recess. Judge Sterling cleared his throat, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. Yes, a 15-minute recess. His voice sounded different now, softer, uncertain. "Dr. Washington, please remain in the courtroom." As the gallery emptied, whispers filled the air. Court officers stood awkwardly by the doors, sensing the unusual tension in the room. Sarah Chen busied herself organizing papers, though her eyes kept darting between the judge and Dr. Washington. Once the courtroom was mostly empty, Judge Sterling stood up. He no longer looked like the stern, unyielding figure from just minutes ago. Instead, he seemed older, more human, more vulnerable. "Dr. Washington," he began, stepping down from the bench, "I owe you an apology. Not just for today, but," he paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily to him. "Would you join me in my chambers? Your attorney is welcome to accompany us." In the judge's chambers, the morning light filtered through Venetian blinds, creating stripes of sunshine across the dark wooden desk. Family photos lined the shelves, including one of Emma at her recent soccer championship, alive and smiling because of the woman standing before him. Dr. Washington sat down, her posture still professional but slightly more relaxed. The exhaustion from her long night of surgeries was more visible now in the natural light. "Emma showed me her trophy last month during her final checkup," she said softly, nodding toward the soccer photo. "She's made a remarkable recovery." Judge Sterling picked up the photo with trembling hands. "She wouldn't be alive without you." He set the frame down and faced Dr. Washington directly. "And this morning, without even looking at you properly, I was ready to send you to jail." Thomas Reed sat quietly, watching this unexpected scene unfold. In his 20 years of practicing law, he had never witnessed anything quite like this. "Your Honor," Dr. Washington spoke carefully, "what happened this morning is about more than just me. It's about every person who stands in your courtroom." The judge sank into his chair, the weight of her words hitting him hard. How many others had he judged unfairly? How many times had he let his prejudices blind him to the human beings standing before him? "Last night," Dr. Washington continued, "I performed 2 emergency surgeries. One was on a 17-year-old boy named Marcus. The other was on a grandmother named Ruth. Both are alive this morning. That's why I missed my original court date 3 months ago. I was saving another life." Judge Sterling looked at the medical documentation on his desk that he had earlier refused to review. Each page told a story of lives saved, families kept whole, all because Dr. Washington put her patients first. Sarah Chen knocked softly and entered with a stack of files. "Your Honor, I took the liberty of pulling some of your recent cases. There's a pattern you might want to see." The judge nodded slowly, beginning to understand the full scope of what this moment meant. His decisions hadn't just affected Dr. Washington, they had impacted countless lives over his years on the bench. The morning sun had fully risen now, filling the chamber with clear, unforgiving light. In that brightness, Judge Sterling could no longer hide from the truth about himself and his actions. The question was, what would he do with this revelation? Dr. Washington watched him carefully, seeing the internal struggle playing across his face. This moment could either be a real turning point or just another missed opportunity for change. The next few minutes would tell which path Judge Sterling would choose. That evening, Judge Marcus Sterling couldn't sleep. He sat in his home office, surrounded by law books and case files, with only a desk lamp lighting the room. The clock on the wall showed 11:45 p.m., but his mind kept racing back to the morning's events in courtroom 304. On his desk lay 2 photographs. The first showed his granddaughter Emma scoring a goal in her recent soccer match, something that would never have happened if Dr. Washington hadn't saved her life. The second was a copy of Dr. Washington's medical credentials that Sarah Chen had printed for him. Decades of education, countless lives saved, and numerous awards for her work in poor communities. "Marcus, are you coming to bed?" His wife Linda appeared in the doorway, wearing her blue robe. She knew that look on her husband's face, the one he got when his world had been shaken. "I almost sent her to jail, Linda," he said quietly, still staring at the photos. "The same doctor who saved Emma's life. I didn't even look at her properly. I just saw." His voice trailed off, unable to finish the painful truth. Linda walked into the office and sat across from him. "Tell me what happened," she said gently. So he did, starting with the morning's court session and ending with his shameful realization. Meanwhile, across town in Philadelphia General Hospital, Dr. Maya Washington was finishing another late shift. She stood at the nurse's station, updating patient charts, her mind occasionally drifting to that morning's events in court. "Dr. Washington," a young resident approached her. "The family of Marcus Thompson, your surgery patient from last night. They wanted you to have this." He handed her a hand-drawn card, covered in colorful crayon drawings. Opening it, she found a picture of herself drawn by Marcus's little sister. Underneath, in wobbly letters, it said, "Thank you for saving my big brother." The simple message brought tears to her eyes, reminding her why she had chosen this path despite all the obstacles. Back in his office, Judge Sterling began pulling files from his past cases. Sarah Chen's words about patterns haunted him. He started making notes, creating 2 columns on a legal pad. The evidence was becoming clear, and it made him sick to his stomach. His phone buzzed, a text from Emma. "Grandpa, Mom told me what happened today. Dr. W is amazing, isn't she? She checks on me every time I have a follow-up. She even came to my soccer game last month." The judge's hands shook as he read the message. He remembered Dr. Washington's words from that morning. "What happened today is about more than just me." In her hospital office, Dr. Washington finally sat down after her shift. A news alert popped up on her computer, another story about bias in the justice system. She thought about Judge Sterling's face when he finally recognized her, the moment when his carefully built walls began to crack. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out an old photograph, her graduation day from medical school. She was the only black woman in her class. Her mother had told her that day, "Baby, you're not just becoming a doctor. You're becoming a mirror that shows people their own prejudices." At midnight, Judge Sterling was still awake. He walked to his kitchen for water and found Linda waiting with 2 cups of tea. "Remember what my father used to say?" Linda asked, sliding a cup toward him. "The hardest person to judge fairly is yourself." The judge nodded, warming his hands around the cup. "I've spent 25 years on the bench, Linda. How many lives have I affected? How many Dr. Washingtons have stood before me, and I never saw them for who they really were?" In the quiet of that late hour, both Judge Sterling and Dr. Washington, in their separate places, were thinking about change. The judge opened his laptop and began typing a letter to the State Judicial Review Board. Dr. Washington finished her patient notes and added one more thing to her schedule, a lecture on bias in healthcare and justice systems that she'd been invited to give. The night grew deeper, but for both of them, something new was beginning. Sometimes it takes a mirror to show us who we really are, and sometimes that mirror comes in the form of a person we almost wronged. In a few hours, the sun would rise on a new day, and both the judge and the doctor would face their own reflections again. But now, they were both a little more aware of the weight their actions carried and the power they had to create change. 1 week after the courtroom incident, Judge Sterling sat in his office surrounded by towers of case files. His desk calendar showed 7:30 a.m., but he had been there since dawn. Sarah Chen stood nearby, adding another stack of folders to the already crowded space. "That's the last 5 years of cases, Your Honor," Sarah said, pointing to the colored tabs she had organized. Red for harsh sentences, yellow for moderate, and green for lenient ones. The pattern was impossible to ignore. The red tabs appeared much more frequently on files of minority defendants. Judge Sterling picked up one of the red-tagged files. "James Carter, African American, age 19. First offense, shoplifting. I gave him 6 months." His voice grew heavy. "Next case that same day. Michael Brooks, white, age 20. Same charge, same circumstances. 3 months probation." Sarah watched as her boss, once so certain of his judgments, now questioned every decision. The proud man who never admitted mistakes was gone, replaced by someone determined to face uncomfortable truths. Across town, Dr. Washington was giving her morning rounds at Philadelphia General Hospital when her phone buzzed. It was an email from the State Judicial Review Board, requesting her presence at a hearing. Judge Sterling had reported himself for bias in sentencing and listed her case as evidence. "Everything okay, Dr. W?" asked Jenny, her favorite nurse, noticing her surprised expression. "Yes," Dr. Washington replied, still staring at her phone. "Just unexpected news. Sometimes people can surprise you in good ways." Back in his chambers, Judge Sterling met with Judge Maria Rodriguez, a respected colleague known for her fair sentencing. She sat across from him, reviewing his findings. Marcus, she said, looking up from the papers, what you're doing is brave. But it's also going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. Some of your colleagues won't thank you for shining this light on the system. Sterling nodded, remembering how he used to dismiss concerns about bias in the courts. Maria, I've been wrong for so long. Last week, I almost sent a brilliant surgeon to jail because I couldn't see past my own prejudice. How many others have I wronged? Throughout the day, he met with other judges, legal scholars, and civil rights attorneys. Each meeting was harder than the last, but he didn't shy away from the difficult conversations. Meanwhile, Dr. Washington received another surprising call. The local bar association wanted her to speak at their upcoming conference about her experience. She sat in her office, thinking about the request. I'm a surgeon, not a public speaker, she told her colleague, Dr. James Chen, during their lunch break. Maybe that's exactly why you should do it, Dr. Chen replied. You can help them see the person behind the defendant's table. Back in the courthouse, Sarah Chen brought Judge Sterling his afternoon coffee and found him reviewing video recordings of his past court sessions. The recordings showed a pattern he had never noticed before: his different tones of voice, his body language, his rushed judgments. Your Honor, Sarah said carefully, Channel 7 News has been calling. They've heard about your self-review and want to do a story. Sterling shook his head. This isn't about publicity, Sarah. It's about fixing what I broke. He picked up another file. Look at this one. Sandra Thompson, denied bail for a minor offense. Single mother, lost her job because of my decision. As the day went on, more files revealed more patterns. Judge Sterling made notes on each case where his bias might have affected his judgment. The list grew longer, but he didn't stop. Each name represented a person whose life he had impacted. By evening, his office looked like a war room, with files spread everywhere and sticky notes covering his walls. Sarah had stayed late to help, feeling part of something important. We'll need to review at least 10 years of cases, he said, rubbing his tired eyes. And then, Sarah asked. And then we start making things right, he replied, picking up his phone to make another call to the review board. Outside his window, the sunset painted Philadelphia's skyline in shades of orange and purple. In her hospital office, Dr. Washington was finishing her day's work when she decided to accept the Bar Association's invitation. Change, she realized, happened one conversation at a time. The Philadelphia County Courthouse's largest meeting room was packed. Judge Sterling stood at the podium, facing over 200 people, former defendants, lawyers, community leaders, and fellow judges. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, highlighting the nervous sweat on his forehead. My name is Marcus Sterling, he began, his voice shaking slightly. For 25 years, I've served as a judge in this courthouse, and for 25 years, I've been part of the problem. He paused, looking at the faces before him. Today, that changes. In the front row, Dr. Maya Washington sat next to Sarah Chen. They watched as the judge who once ruled his courtroom with rigid authority now stood humble before the community he had hurt. We've reviewed over 3,000 of my past cases, Sterling continued, pointing to the screen behind him showing statistics. The evidence of my bias is clear and undeniable. African American defendants received sentences averaging 40% longer than white defendants for the same crimes. Latino defendants faced higher bail amounts. Asian Americans were more often denied interpreters. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some nodded in recognition of their own experiences, others looked shocked at the numbers. But numbers don't tell the whole story, Sterling said, his voice growing stronger. Behind each case is a person whose life I affected. James Carter lost his scholarship because of my harsh sentence. Maria Gonzalez's children went into foster care because I denied her bail. David Chen's restaurant closed when I refused to consider his family circumstances. In the audience, some people wiped tears. Others sat straight-backed, their faces showing years of stored pain. I can't undo the past, Sterling admitted, but I can work to make it right. He gestured to a team of lawyers sitting at a side table. Starting today, we're launching the Sterling Review Initiative. Every case where my bias affected the outcome will be reviewed. We have partnered with the Public Defender's Office and private law firms who will work pro bono to help overturn unjust sentences. Dr. Washington watched as some audience members hugged each other. She remembered her own morning in his courtroom, how close she had come to joining the list of lives disrupted by prejudice. The judge continued, "We've also established a compensation fund. I'm selling my vacation home and contributing my own savings. It won't fix everything, but it's a start." Sarah Chen stood up and walked to the podium with more files. These had green stickers, cases already identified for immediate review. The work had already begun. But the biggest change, Sterling said, looking directly at his fellow judges, must be in how we move forward. "I'm working with the Judicial Review Board to create new guidelines for checking bias in sentencing. Every judge will be required to review their own patterns twice a year." Some of his colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Change wasn't easy, especially for those used to being beyond question. After the presentation, people lined up to speak with Judge Sterling. Each had a story, a case, a memory. He listened to everyone, writing down names, case numbers, details. No more rushing through lives as if they were just numbers on a docket. Dr. Washington approached him last. "That couldn't have been easy," she said, extending her hand. Sterling shook it, remembering how differently he had treated her just weeks ago. "The easy path led me wrong for 25 years, Doctor. It's time for the harder road." Later that afternoon, news crews gathered outside the courthouse. The story was spreading. A judge admitting bias, working to make amends, challenging the system itself. Some called it career suicide. Others called it a watershed moment. In his chambers, Judge Sterling met with the first group of lawyers who would review his old cases. The work ahead was enormous, but for the first time in his career, he felt like he was truly serving justice. Dr. Washington returned to her hospital, where she found a message waiting. Other courts in other cities wanted to know more about the Sterling Initiative. Change, like a pebble thrown in water, was creating ripples. That evening, as the courthouse emptied, Sarah Chen found Judge Sterling still at his desk, reviewing more files. On his wall hung a new sign, written in clear letters. "Justice is not just what we do, but how we do it." The real work was just beginning. 3 months after Judge Sterling's public admission, the Philadelphia Judicial Center's main auditorium was filled to capacity. Dr. Maya Washington stood at the podium, facing an audience of judges, lawyers, and medical professionals from across the country. "Medicine and justice have something important in common," she began, her voice clear and confident. "In both fields, our biases can mean the difference between life and death, freedom or imprisonment." In the front row, Judge Sterling sat with Sarah Chen, both taking notes. The conference, titled "Breaking Bias: Healthcare and Justice," was the first of its kind, bringing together professionals from both worlds to address systemic prejudice. "6 months ago, I was almost sent to jail for a traffic violation," Dr. Washington continued, showing a slide of her operating room. "The same day, I had saved 2 lives through emergency surgery. But in that courtroom, none of that mattered. I wasn't seen as Dr. Washington, the neurosurgeon. I was just another face that fit someone's prejudiced expectations." The audience shifted uncomfortably. Many recognized their own biases in her words. At the back of the room, Emma, Judge Sterling's granddaughter, sat with her parents. Now fully recovered from her brain surgery, she watched the doctor who had saved her life teach another kind of healing the system itself. "But this story isn't about one judge or one doctor," Dr. Washington said. "It's about the choices we make every day. In the ER, I can't choose which patients deserve care based on how they look. And in a courtroom, justice must be equally blind." She clicked to the next slide, showing the results of the Sterling Initiative's first 3 months. 157 cases reviewed. 89 sentences reduced or overturned. $1.2 million in compensation distributed. 23 other judges voluntarily joining the review process. Judge Sterling stood up next, joining Dr. Washington at the podium. The man who once commanded his courtroom with stern authority now spoke with humility. "We discovered something powerful," he said. "When we admit our mistakes and work to fix them, people trust the system more. In the past 3 months, court appearances have gone up. People believe they might actually get a fair hearing." Sarah Chen presented the next part, showing how they had changed the court's daily operations. Every judge now had a bias check system. Case reviews happened monthly, not yearly. Public defenders got more resources. During the lunch break, Dr. Washington walked through the hospital halls with Judge Sterling. They stopped at the pediatric ward, where some of her young patients were recovering. "Remember what you told me that day in your chambers?" she asked. "About not being able to undo the past." Sterling nodded, watching a child in a wheelchair practice walking with a physical therapist. "In medicine," she continued, "we can't undo damage either, but we can help heal. We can help people move forward. That's what you're doing with the initiative." Back at the conference, afternoon sessions focused on practical changes. Other courts shared their plans to adopt similar programs. Medical schools discussed new training to address bias in healthcare. Law schools presented updated curricula. Emma joined them for the final panel, sharing her story from both sides. As a patient saved by Dr. Washington, and as the granddaughter of a judge who had learned to change. "My grandfather taught me that being strong means admitting when you're wrong," she told the audience. "And Dr. Washington showed me that every person deserves to be seen for who they really are." As the day ended, Dr. Washington received news that 5 more cities had requested information about starting their own bias review programs. Judge Sterling found more judges volunteering to review their past cases. In the parking lot that evening, Dr. Washington caught up with Judge Sterling as he was leaving. "We're making progress," she said, "but there's still so much work to do." "Yes," he agreed, "but now we're doing it together. Doctors, judges, lawyers, communities, all of us learning to see each other clearly." They looked up at the hospital building, where lights glowed in patient rooms, and then at the courthouse next door, where late-working lawyers still moved through lit offices. 2 places of power, of life-changing decisions, slowly learning to serve everyone equally. The next day would bring more cases, more surgeries, more chances to either perpetuate bias or fight it, but now there was a path forward, and they weren't walking it alone. 1 year had passed since that fateful morning in courtroom 304. The National Judicial Conference in Washington, D.C. was packed with over 1,000 attendees. Judge Marcus Sterling and Dr. Maya Washington stood together backstage, preparing for their keynote speech. "Nervous?" Dr. Washington asked, noticing Judge Sterling adjusting his tie for the 3rd time. "A little," he admitted. "A year ago, I was just a judge who thought he knew everything. Now I'm speaking to judges from all 50 states about everything I got wrong." Through the curtain, they could see Emma sitting in the front row. Now 17, she had become an active speaker at high schools about bias and justice. Next to her sat Sarah Chen, recently promoted to Chief Court Administrator, her new position created specifically to oversee bias prevention programs. The conference host approached the podium. "Today's speakers need no introduction. Their story has inspired change in courts across America. Please welcome Judge Marcus Sterling and Dr. Maya Washington." As they walked onto the stage, the audience rose in a standing ovation. On screens behind them, numbers told their story. 1,247 cases reviewed and corrected. 37 states adopting similar programs. $4.5 million in compensation distributed. 89% reduction in sentencing disparities in participating courts. 1 year ago, Dr. Washington began, I stood in a courtroom facing jail time. Today, I stand before you as a partner in change. She looked at Judge Sterling. But this isn't just about 2 people. It's about all the lives touched by bias, and all the lives now being touched by reform. Judge Sterling stepped forward. "The hardest moment in any judge's life," he said, "is admitting we've been wrong. But the most important moment is deciding to make it right." They showed videos from across the country. A young man graduating college after his unjust conviction was overturned. A grandmother opening a new business with her compensation funds. Judges and doctors working together to address bias in both professions. In the middle of their presentation, breaking news flashed on everyone's phones. The Supreme Court had just announced new national guidelines for bias review in all federal courts, based on the Sterling Initiative. Sarah Chen hurried backstage and handed them the news release. Dr. Washington read it aloud to the audience, her voice trembling with emotion. "The justice system must reflect the truth that every human being deserves to be seen, heard, and judged fairly." After the main presentation, they held workshops. Judges shared their experiences implementing reform. Public defenders discussed improved resources. Medical professionals talked about parallel changes in healthcare. During the lunch break, Emma joined them at their table. "Grandpa," she said, showing him her phone, "my story about you and Dr. Washington won the National High School Essay Contest. They want to publish it in law journals." Judge Sterling hugged his granddaughter, remembering how close he had come to losing her, and how his prejudice had almost made him hurt the very person who saved her. Later that afternoon, Dr. Washington led a session on emergency room bias. "In surgery, we can't choose our patients," she explained. "In justice, you can't choose who deserves fair treatment. Everyone deserves the same care, the same justice, the same respect." As the conference ended, Judge Sterling received an unexpected honor. The National Judicial College announced a new annual award, the Sterling Washington Prize for Judicial Reform, recognizing judges who work to eliminate bias in their courts. "This award isn't for me," he said during the ceremony. "It's for every person who stood in my courtroom and didn't receive the justice they deserved. It's for every judge willing to look in the mirror and change. It's for every Dr. Washington who persists despite the barriers we put in their way." That evening, as they left the conference center, they saw a group of young law students waiting to talk to them, the next generation of judges and lawyers, eager to learn from their story. "Do you ever regret that morning in court?" one student asked Dr. Washington. She looked at Judge Sterling, then at Emma, then back at the student. "That morning showed us that change is possible. When we see each other clearly, when we admit our mistakes, when we work to make things right, that's when justice becomes real." As they walked into the Washington evening, they passed the Supreme Court building, its words carved in stone, "Equal justice under law," meant something different now. Something deeper, truer, and more human than ever before. The story wasn't over, but now it belonged to everyone willing to look in the mirror and choose to change.